Well, truth and trust, two big themes of the conference, the symposium that we're all at in the context of polarization. So I wanted to point your attention to Hannah Arendt, a philosopher from the middle of last century. And she argued that loneliness, people who weren't connected to institutions and perhaps who weren't being heard, were more liable to be persuaded by extreme propaganda. And I thought that was interesting. It's something we've already covered earlier this morning a little. And in this session, we're going to be talking about deep listening, which is, as the name says on the tin, it's like listening, but just deeper. So it is foundational to connecting and engaging across divides. As Roselle said earlier, it's creating the psychological safety to allow people to think, perhaps, as well as speak uncomfortable truths that perhaps we all need to hear. So I think as we've got a lot of leaders in the room here in media, in government, in the private sector, and NGOs, and it is a critical skill in order to change the world, especially when you're in a power relationship with somebody else or a different culture or when there's other types of divides. And it seems to be very fitting to be having this conversation here in Banff. And in fact, yesterday morning, I spent 3 hours on a log with some First Nation knowledge holders, and they were talking to me about the culture of listening in their community. And it was amazing how much was overlapping with all the research that I've been doing. So this session is going to be really, really practical, a chance to try and practice some skills. There's a lot of doing rather than just listening to me spieling on at you. And you can use it in conversations that matter with your partners, with your clients, with your colleagues, and even, dare I say it, with your family. Yeah? As somebody, I can't even say my kids are teenagers anymore because they're older than that, but it is really useful. Though my kids say, "Don't you try that deep listening on me, Mum," a fair amount of times. So can it work in different cultural contexts? Well, in fact, last week, the week before last, I just finished a project, the BBC and the British Council. I work at the BBC, head of special projects at the World Service, and I trained not far off 1,000 people in 119 countries over 3 weeks on Zoom in deep listening. And then at the end, we got them a lot of practice through the sessions. They then had crossing divides conversations. And it pretty was cross-cultural. Number 1 country, Malaysia. Number 2, Iran. And then UK came there too, as well as Canadians and Americans, you'll be glad to hear. So now, I often, when I talk about deep listening, find that there's a lot of people in the room who might know more than me, and I felt that Roselle and a lot of other people this morning had a lot of skill. So where are you on your listening journey, 1 to 5? Do you want to point some fingers in the air, just so I get a sense? I get a 4 over there, a 3, 3s, yeah, 3s, okay, 1. So yeah. I'm going to need your help because you're going to have a chance to practice with each other and we're going to draw on your skills. But also, you can just put your hand up if you think that I could have said something a bit wrong or could have said something better and you want to put me right. Please feel free. This is a sort of relaxed conversation we're going to have. And also, the journey isn't about being perfect or getting things right. It is fine if you make a mistake, and I'm going to give you a live demo in a little while, and I hope it's okay if I also make a mistake, and I will listen with humility as you correct me and tell me what I could have done better. It is safe. We all okay with that, yeah? I would say one thing, when you do have your conversations, anything that goes on between the two of you stays between the two of you, so you can feel safe to speak your truth. So to deeply listen, we need to feel truly open to another, and it actually takes a lot of courage. It is truly hard to risk opening ourselves up to somebody because, after all, we might end up changing our mind. And that can be pretty frightening, huh? And through my work at the BBC leading Crossing Divides, when I was bringing two people with conflicting ideas together, and we had 50 million social views, 50 million online views, a lot of different stories, not just in news, but across lots of different aspects of the BBC. I talked to psychologists, social psychologists, neuroscientists, lawyers, academics, and fellow coaches. I'm also an exec coach. And I also learned a lot in an intense conflict mediation course in Montana, and doing research at LSE and published stuff in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and happy to share that afterwards if you want to know more. And I found out what is super critical is about your intention, about putting aside your own agenda temporarily in your heart to be genuinely curious about someone else's story, to want to understand them. And it's interesting from the research, a person will feel heard more the fact that you have a desire to understand them than you have actually understood them. Which doesn't kind of make sense, but on the other hand, it might. And the reason that it works is that when people feel truly heard, they feel safer, less defensive, more open to see their own world clearer. So they move from having an autocracy in their mind, you know, with your big walls up, to being more of a democracy when you can understand that there may be two truths. So it's magical, transformative, simple and hard, especially when we know we're right, talking to people with other opinions or people from different backgrounds than us. And what you need to do is to focus 150% of your attention. So could I ask you in the session today, am I allowed to say that you will put aside your phones, not only off, but out of view? There's research that when adults, parents take kids to the Science Museum and they have their phone on, even if they don't look at it, it still distracts them. So no phones if people are okay with that. Although you can tweet using these hashtags. Small thing for that. So to gather ourselves here, is it okay if we do a bit of mindful meditation together? Are people okay with that, yeah? So could I invite you to sit upright in your chair and to uncross your legs if they're crossed, and to close your eyes if you feel comfortable, or cast them down. And start to become aware of your breath. The air entering your body and the air leaving your body. Feel your shoulders. Are they clenched? You can allow them to let go. And your brow and your jaw. Can you feel your seat touching the chair? And your feet touching the earth? And return your attention back to your breath. Notice its texture, the start of the breath, and the moment when the breath turns. You don't need to do anything to change it. Allow it to be as it already is. You may notice that your mind wanders. That's what our minds do. Notice if you have any judgments about yourself and let these go. And bring your attention back to your breath. Now I'd like you to think of someone you know who is a really good listener. If no one comes to mind, you can imagine someone who is a really good listener. What does it feel like to be listened to by them? And what are they doing that makes you feel they're such a good listener? When you feel ready, I'd like to invite you to open your eyes. Was anybody able to think of someone they knew or imagine someone who is a really good listener? Yeah, I'm seeing a bit of nodding here from you. Tell me who it is, yeah.
My mother.
And what is it that she does that makes you feel that?
I think she's deep.
Shall we have the mic, by the way, here? Is there a mic? I'm just wondering, it might be easier for those who are watching streaming. Thank you.
You guys are getting your steps in.
Yeah, we're going to have a bit of steps going on here. Thank you. Your mother. Let's hear about your mother.
She's deeply empathetic, incredibly patient. She asks questions, and with some exceptions of when I was a teenager, doesn't judge.
That's brilliant. So doesn't judge, is really empathetic, and is patient. And I would say, and there's a kind of differing in the literature around this, is that in a way we can't help but making judgments. That's what we do to make, to do shortcuts in the world. Because if we didn't, we'd have to say, oh my goodness, table, really? Everything we would have to think anew. And therefore we make the judgments. The thing is to become aware and to let them go. Anybody else have any more thoughts? Thank you very much. Anybody else think of a good listener? Can we have a mic over here? Thank you.
Yeah, I thought of my best friend, who is also very non-judgmental, been friends for more than 20 years. And you can say anything, you feel a safe space, non-judgmental, and then asks good questions and will hear things that you didn't even realize you said. Mm-hmm. And kind of like, she'll pick up on something and suddenly you're like, oh, that's something I should deal with, or just the noticing things of what you said that you kind of almost didn't really realize you were getting at.
That is fantastic. And by the end of this session, you're going to have that skill too, okay? Or at least have a go with it. So that is super important. Thank you so much for sharing that. That they're listening to you in such a focused way that they are understanding and grasping some of the core of what you're feeling, but not even expressing and you weren't aware of at the time. Is that right? Yeah? Any other thoughts about what a good listener is? Anybody think of anybody? A lady over here, a mic.
I'm going to do a shout out to my nonprofit. I'm loud. I'm going to do a shout out to my nonprofit colleagues I'm here with, because I felt privileged to be invited to the conference, but I got even more excited when I found out that some of our other nonprofit colleague sectors are here. And we have a really specific group in Calgary called the Social Policy Collaborative. So those of us who are here today are excited about this work.
But what is it that you are doing in a group that makes you think they're such good listeners?
What are we doing? We are listening to one another, and we're talking about issues that matter and that make a difference, and that we are non-judgmental.
So non-judgmental, what else?
And inclusive
okay.
of others' opinions.
Okay.
And so, so I love hearing Patricia from Calgary Homeless Foundation, my friend Sandra from the Calgary DI, and from Jeff Loomis, who's across the way over there. And what I love is that when we come together, we think big, and we do question about the table.
Mm-hmm. So I'm getting a sense from you that you're feeling heard when you're together, a true sense of being heard. So thank you for that. Because, working together, we so seldom have an opportunity to feel heard, yeah? Most of us rarely do. And when we feel heard, particularly if we haven't been heard often, something very profound can shift in us and enable new thoughts to come about. And there's also research, again, tied up with the theme of the conference, is that when people feel truly heard, they reduce what's technically called their attitude extremity, which means that they don't feel so extreme in their ideas because they feel acknowledged and heard. If you're wondering, what is that? This is the bear sound. The bear sound is critical, but the bear, you've got to go back in your cave. We don't need you quite yet. So, don't worry, the bear's going to come out later. We'll have many opportunities for the bear to join. But but not quite yet. Back in your cave, bear. So, didn't expect that as well. I hadn't heard the bear sound. I just tasked these audio guys with bringing the bear. So, my voice has gone a bit bear sound now. So, talking about some of the critical skills of deep listening, and sort of simple, and I am condensing a kind of more lengthy, there's so much about deep listening, just to give you guys a bit of a flavour here. But, when you talked about being heard, and you talked about your best friend, and listening between the words, I got a real sense of presence. And that's why we began with a meditation, because presence and attention is so critical, yeah? And in order to do this, there has to be internal listening first. You have to listen to yourself. So as a coach, often before doing sessions, I will put some time in my diary aside, especially on Zoom, just to get myself into a place of presence, which is one I really like doing the meditation sessions at the beginning, because it also allows me to center myself and cope with unexpected bears or other things that might happen. So having that calmness and focus and feeling earthed and open. And, there's a lot of interesting work, people like analysts, people like Jung, who talked about our shadows. And it's a big journey to become more familiar with our shadows. But if we're aware of stuff that might be triggered in a conversation, we know a difficult conversation, and we're able to acknowledge that to ourselves, we can then be in a place to listen to somebody else. If you think about your best listeners, they probably are people, my guess is, who are quite earthed, who have come to terms with quite a lot of their own stuff and can acknowledge it and put it aside in order to be able to listen to you. Other thing is body language. There's the gaze, eye contact, and obviously it differs a lot, as I heard from when I was doing the training with people in all these different countries. There's a lot of differences about eye contact and when it's aggressive. And certainly on Zoom, when you have people face to face, it's like usually you're either going to kill somebody or kiss them if you're that close. Can feel intimidating. But there's a lot of research about the gaze and how people in a lot of cultures can feel acknowledged by looking, but there are lots of different types of gazes. You can gaze in a sexual way, you can gaze in a hostile way, but you can also look at somebody with understanding and empathy for them, and you can look at them with your heart in your eyes. When I met these people from the community yesterday morning, when I shook hands, they gave me a very weak handshake because they said they believe that their heart is in their hands, and therefore they don't want to squash somebody else's heart. Oh, that was very, very beautiful. And in a way, it's almost as if your heart is in your eyes when you're listening to somebody. So it's a different type of gaze. And there's also that kind of open posture rather than kind of tight hands folded. I'm sure you've all thought about that. And then there's silence. And why is silence such a power tool in deep listening? Because the human mind seems to think in waves and then in pauses. And inside that pause, something almost magical happens, which can create another thought. And if you come in there and you interrupt, or as one academic has said, it's like preloading your verbal gun with ammunition so you can fire and interject. Anybody ever done that when they've listened, huh? In order to make such a brilliant point, which is far better than what the person is going to say. But what you're doing, of course, is saying, what I say is more important than what you think. And I think the other thing that a lot of us have a tendency to do is to want to connect with the other person and say, it's so interesting you saying that because me too. It's so funny you should say that because what's happened to me? And what we're doing, of course, is we're taking the spotlight from them and onto ourselves. And actually, we can forge much deeper connections by listening to them. Because as a speaker, we don't just speak at the surface of our things, as George Steiner said. We don't come with pre-packaged ideas. We need somebody to really listen to us so we can unpack them and get to a deeper narrative, which is useful for ourselves. So when you do this little exercise you're going to do with the bears, I would ask you to wait for 10 seconds after the other person's finished speaking before you come in, and I'll tell you in which way you're going to come in. And 10 seconds is very, very different to 5 seconds, and it's going to feel really, really super weird. But research came out last year, Silence is Golden, said that when people who were doing mediation were both told to be silent, they came up with many more win-win creative solutions than the sort of zero sum, either me or you win. So just play with this long silence and see what it feels like. By the way, everybody overestimates their seconds of silence. They also found that out. So how are you going to check your understanding? Yeah? You do this, and it's so important so that the speaker feels heard. You take a stab at summing up what we heard earlier with your friend, the essential essence, the core, and what's underneath what the person you think is really saying. You don't have to take notes. You need to trust yourself because you're listening not just with your intellectual mind, but also with your heart, that you will get that. But the good news is that you don't just have to assume it, because that's what we do most of the time. We don't check. We just assume we know what they mean, and we go about, but often it's wrong. So we offer it back with humility, and we'll say, I think what you said is, or I'm hearing, and you say what the core is that right? And they'll say, yeah, and you know you haven't really got it right. So you'll say, what have I missed? Or what more? Because you want to go deeper, not what else, which takes you sideways. Yeah? So it's quite hard, but when you're doing this listening, you've got what somebody, I thought was a lovely phrase, they called it an electrifying stillness, when you're utterly focused with your whole being on what the other person is saying. You don't have to mirror the same words, but if they use metaphors or superlatives, try and capture those, because often they're clues as to what the person's really, really thinking. And when you're aware that your agenda or your assumptions or your judgments come back up, be aware, acknowledge, be kind to yourself, and let them go. Because you don't just have one go, you do it as an iterative process until the speaker goes, yes, and you feel the sense of energy, and then you can still say, what more? And give a speaker the opportunity to think more deeply. So I'm now going to do a demo, and at the end of 4 minutes, the bear is going to come onto the stage, at least orally, to give me the end. So who would like to be my fellow participant here? Good news, and we'll need a mic, is that I'll tell you the question I'm going to ask you. Tell me something about your first name, your last name, or your nickname. And just tell me just something, and we'll see how it goes. And I'm going to deep listen to you, and we can see how I did afterwards, and we can do a critique of me. Is that okay? Yeah? And I trust you that it's not going to be so humiliating, your comments, that I'm going to be able to cope. So who would like to volunteer to do this? And it's quite fun. We're in a nice community here. I'd like to go to you, but you've spoken as a speaker. So if somebody who isn't a speaker, and if not, I will go to you. Who hasn't? Was there another hand who's not a speaker?
Yeah, but I will be tomorrow.
You will be tomorrow. I mean, all of you. This lady.
I'm not a speaker.
Fantastic. Thank you. Can we give her a round of applause? Okay. So I'm going to ask you to we'll just get rid of the rest of the room. And although we shouldn't actually be in a face-to-face, that's quite conflictual. We might want to be more like that. So, yeah, cool. We're going to do some dancing as well. No, so will you tell me something about, just something, anything small, about one of your names? First name, last name, nickname.
Okay, so my first name is Colby, spelled with a K and an I, not a C and a Y. But I'm still like the cheese, Colby cheese, and that's how I tell people to remember my name, because they usually want to call me something else, because Colby doesn't make sense. The other thing that I'll say is that my name altogether, so it's Colby Kakurba, so there are a lot of K's and vowels, and that's really hard to say over the phone or when you're trying to tell people how to spell your name. Is that what you wanted? Perfect. That's my name.
So I'm getting a sense from you that your name, you're both proud of it, and yet you recognize that there's some challenges around it. There's a sense of ambiguity, and it's important that people get the K and get the I. And it's like part of your name, and that there's a lot of vowels and consonants, especially with your first and last name, but there's a sort of, you want people to understand it because it's you. Is that right?
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I would say that's very right. I really resonate with my name. When I was a kid, people used to put me in all the boys' classes because my name sounds very masculine, I guess. So yeah, I feel like it was always really important to me that not only did people spell it right, but they knew I was a girl. I don't know why.
So it's your name. You appreciate that you see from others' perspectives. They may put you in a male-boy box, especially as a kid, but your gender and identity is something you're really proud of, that you've been gifted this name and you've carried it through your life, and it's unusual and special.
Yeah. I'm the queen of awkward silences. Yeah. My middle name is very feminine. It's Sarah without the H. So sometimes people assume that's my white name. If they don't know who I am, they'll call me Sarah, thinking that my first name is something else, but Colby is my regular name.
So I'm getting a sense from what you've told me in these little different stories that there's what people are assuming about you, there's a lot of what others might think or perhaps wrongly think, and there's you and your name, and you owning your name with pride as a little bit of an opposition to other people not getting it.
Yeah.
And there's pride there.
Yeah, I think so. Especially with, I don't know why, but with my first name, I really resonate with my first name. I get rid of my last name this year, and that's exciting. But my first name is something I really love about myself, I guess. And I think I look like a Colby, right? Just kidding.
I think that means the 4 minutes is up. Thank you very much. I think we'll give her a big round of applause. So first of all, what did that, apart from the fact there were all these guys and a bear here, what did that process feel like?
The awkward silences were super awkward, and I really wanted to fill them, but I didn't want to take up too much time. It also felt weird talking about myself, and I guess it was interesting hearing back what you heard compared to what I said, because what you heard and what you repeated back to me was true, but it wasn't in any of the words that I used. And that I found very interesting and very compelling.
Well, thank you very, very much. Thank you. Now, I don't know what you thought about. One of the things I was trying to do with Colby was not just focus on the words that she spoke, but on the meaning and also the emotions. Now, there's research that if you don't feed back the emotions, and they're rarely expressed in words, they're often just expressed through body language and your heart, you sense them, like the pride that she felt, like the sort of, I could just see when she talked about it, you know, that she feels really good about her name, that it's a core part of her identity and the way she feels and the way she looks. And if you don't do the emotions, people will not feel heard, however brilliant you are at feeding back all the other stuff. So that is really, really critical. And what's interesting, I don't know, first of all, any reactions to that little obvious kind of fake performance in front of everybody? What do people think? What did I do well? What could have I done better? Any thoughts? Was it what you expected? Anybody else who hasn't spoken? Mike over here, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
This lady over here. Did you put your hand up?
Already. I mean, someone else.
What, did you put your hand up?
Oh, I did, but I spoke already, so if there's someone else.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's this gentleman here. Thank you.
Waiting for the disembodied mic. So the 10-second pause, which you made a point of saying is part of the discipline, is that for you to process what someone else is saying, or is it for you to have them think about what they've said, or for them to feel they've been heard? Because I think on the latter, it breaks with an expectation of response of feedback to what one said in a way that could actually make someone feel unheard. Although it might help you process what they've said rather than simply react immediately. So I'm just wondering what the conception of that is and the thinking behind it.
Thank you. Really interesting question. And I would say it's for all of them, apart from making them feel awkward. Because when you give people that sort of silence, that sort of warm, empathetic silence. We used the word empathy earlier when people were talking about, I think it was you used it with your mum. They will then have other thoughts about the mind thinking in these waves and pauses. And I know as a coach, there are different types of silences. So somebody's silent, and then often they'll do this. They'll go, they'll look top right. And I know they're going on a journey. And because I'm with them on that journey, they'll come back. And that journey will be so much richer because they can feel my support, whether or not they choose to share what's come out of that journey when they come back. Making people feel good, I would say in reality 10 seconds can feel a long time. I'd love you to practice it because I just think it's interesting to see how you feel about it. In reality, something like 5 seconds probably is worth going. Something a little bit shorter. Sorry, my iPad's decided to get rid of, see how it is doing. I would say that there's a neuroscientist, Uri Hasson, in Princeton, who's found that when people are feeling really well listened to, the listener's brain begins to resemble the speaker's brain. And the more they understand about the speaker's story, the more their brains start to echo each other. And the waves start to echo each other, which is so interesting. So we talked about the 3 power tools, which were, very quickly,
We weren't listening.
What were? That just shows you, you speak and you think, what were the 3 power tools? Anybody remember any of them? Yeah, just shout them out loud. Body language. Eye contact, part of body language. Silence. Check for understanding. Yeah, that's the 4th. And presence. Presence and listening to yourself. Attention, I think perhaps is the most important of everything. And going into that necessary personal, space. And I think it can be really useful before you go into a meeting, especially those conversations that matter, that you check in about what your agenda is. Is it to glean information? Is it to influence? Is it to establish trust? Is it just to get on and have fun? I mean, not that you have to think every time you're in a social gathering, what's my conversation? But, it's in difficult conversations, in conversations that matter, in order that you can then temporarily put that aside. Because you need to abandon temporarily your instrumental objective. And I would say as a journalist, this is bloody hard. Because naturally, I love questions, and I want to drive the conversation where I think it's most interesting and where it needs to go. And deep listening is all about surrendering that agenda and letting the speaker take you down the road where they think is more important. But what I have learned time and time again is when I do that surrender, I'm taken down avenues I would have never anticipated and expected. So, for example, I went to talk to dairy farmers who didn't believe in climate change to try and understand their deeper narrative. And I do believe in climate change, and I had to put that aside temporarily to really understand and make them feel heard. And I was really pleased at the end when I published this article that this older guy who was really thoughtful but did believe it was a construction by people in Whitehall in central government, he did feel heard in that I represented his perspective in the article, even though I couched it with a lot of scientific evidence of the reality of dairy farming and climate change. I would also say it's about trust, because you need to be able to trust yourself to understand another, enough to be able to give them that nugget, present to them of your attempt to understand them, and they then will refine it and think more deeply, sometimes in opposition, sometimes you've got it right. And I think we noticed that a little bit in this demo. I don't know whether you felt it, but I felt there was a sense of you having more thoughts because you were being heard. Would you say that's right? So that's what the invitation is for you. Because ultimately, when you allow people to feel heard, you give them that recognition, that dignity, a greater sense of agency, the sort of full moral beings in their personhood, because you're listening with your heart. And that's why it is so very powerful. So instead of me going on, you guys got to get a chance. You need to find someone you have not yet spoken to today, ever, and you are going to 5 minutes of deep listening. Then there's going to be 1 minute, and you both give feedback to each other, and then 5 minutes of deep listening and another 1 minute of feedback with bear sounds to let you know when the time is up. And the question you'll be asking the other person is, tell me something about your first name, your last name, or your nickname, just like we did over here, yeah? You can choose your last name. And when you do this, you will be tempted to go into normal conversation because that's going to find interesting things. You're going to be tempted to ask questions. Do not. The only question I asked today in that demo was one question, tell me. The rest of the time, I did my best to try and sum up the essential core of what she says. The words, the emotions, and the meaning, underlying meaning between those words. Everything stays confidential between your pair. Yeah? Is everybody up for this? You're a little bit of skeptical faces and a little bit of yeah, I've got a thumbs up over there. Well, that's obviously on behalf of everybody here. And all of those who are live streaming, they can also find somebody and practice for 5 minutes plus 1, 5 minutes plus 1 of the feedback. And if you notice yourself straying, just put up your hand and say, I shouldn't have done that. Let me go back to deep listening. So even if you've already been on many courses on active listening, just try it along these lines and see what happens, and we'll all feedback together. So I think we can begin our clock. You have 1 minute to find your person and decide who speaks first, and then 5 minutes plus 1, 5 minutes plus 1, okay? A long one, long, a long bear, long big bear. More. Okay. So shall we, if you could round up your conversations. If you can round up the conversations, that would be great. You can continue them this evening, because you've got another thing to do over lunch, I'll tell you in a minute. So I want to hear from people. What was that like? What did it feel like doing this deep listening? What did it feel like being heard? What surprised them? What people found hard? Awkward? Any thoughts? You're clearly in lots of brilliantly deep conversations. I couldn't get you guys to stop, not even with a horde of bears. So what do people feel? Or can we get a mic to this lady here? Thank you.
I think it was surprising how emotional people can be, or how much emotion they hold around their name, and how much people are willing to share. I think it was a really wonderful exercise.
Thank you. And what did you notice about that's about the speaking. What did you notice about the listening?
That awkward silences are very hard. And that it's hard not to fill them, but giving feedback and reframing is really gets you thinking about not just the words that were spoken, but about the emotions that were expressed.
And I'm wondering, were you working together? I don't know who was working with. I'm wondering what it felt for you to be heard, not just in the words, but in the reframe and the emotions. What was that like? And you don't have to talk about the substance of what you were.
No, it was interesting because I think that there were emotions that were picked up that I didn't realize I was expressing, which led to the next piece of the conversation and the next piece of the conversation. So I think we went much deeper than I thought we would in 5 minutes about a name.
Yeah, that can often happen. And of course, names aren't just names. They're symbols of our identity. And a lot of people have very different feelings about names. Some people feel really great about their name. Other people struggle with aspects of it. And it can also reveal relationships with family and who gave us our name and our responsibilities. Names carry a lot, even though they feel that they're superficial. But it's obviously up to the speaker to choose. I would say with this type of listening, because it can get quite deep quite quickly, and when the speaker feels trust, they can end up revealing things they perhaps hadn't anticipated. When you're using this sort of approach, I think you need to be aware of the ethical, responsibilities of using this approach, and about if you do hear information, let's say if you're a boss and you're working with one of your colleagues and they're telling you things, you need to check in with them about how they would like to share this information. In other instances, when people give information, we might want to allow them, to share with them our understanding and allow them to reflect on it and check that they're happy that it can be shared later. because time is often very good when we want to listen to people over time. And in fact, sometimes repeatedly about the same question if we do have that time. I remember years ago when I first joined the BBC, I did a documentary course, and there was a whale disaster in a mining village called Aberfan in Wales. And the people who'd made this documentary in the 50s came to talk to us. They were a bit elderly at the time, and talked about going to visit those families on 3 separate occasions and asking them the same questions, because they went deeper each time. So you do get deeper, but you've got those ethical responsibilities, and I think we need to be aware of them. Any other thoughts about people's experiences? There's a lady with a striped T-shirt over here. Thank you.
Thanks. I agree. The awkward 10 seconds is a long time, but it's great. One thing was I felt like it stifled my curiosity a little bit, and I've done a fair bit of this, and that's a consistent finding, because I had a lot of questions for her about what she was saying, but I was trying to echo back rather than intervene with my but why and how and really and that kind of stuff.
When you say stifle your curiosity, tell me more.
So when a person is reflecting on, I want to make something up, so I'm not disclosing, but they're saying, oh, well, I went to the track and it was really interesting and blah, blah, blah. And then you say, well, sorry, when, you're trying to understand, well, when did you go to the track? Give me more context. And was that good for you? Was that bad? Was that, so those types of questions, when you're doing this kind of resonance listening and you're focused on reflecting back, I find it a little bit
constraining.
We do this with our team once a month, so we're fairly practiced. And I always find I end the conversations with a million questions about
It's a really good point. And let's say if you're a journalist and you're doing this with somebody, there are opportunities. This isn't like an approach. It's either yes or no, and if you do it, you've got to be 100%. It's an approach that you may choose to sprinkle in conversations and then have the opportunity to ask those contexts if you don't receive them. I would say, though, that at the beginning, I struggle with that as well, just because I have a lot of questions and I'm that kind of person. But it has been listening to things that I would have never expected and going down their path, not my path, that has taught me the benefits of allowing them that space. But I would say you've still got time for those questions as well. It's not an either or. So that's a really useful. Thank you for sharing that. Any other thoughts? There's a gentleman over here. If we get a mic to him.
Well, you say it.
And if I leave anything out, you can. No, I thought it was really interesting. It was both of us shared the sentiment of it. It took almost every fiber in our being not to say, I understand, or I've been there and I get it, right? Because you don't want to interject your experience. So instead it was, asking questions or trying to dissect and ask if, they understand it right. But then we also reflected and said, I wonder if we did say that we understand and we can relate, that it would kind of be an invitation to, share more. So that was an interesting reflection. Is there anything else that you noticed?
Yeah. Go on, you the mic.
It was a great conversation. Just that there was an empathetic connection and resonance that actually created, I think, a kind of trust that may not have been there between otherwise two strangers. But again, as T was saying, it felt like we were about to break the rules, as it were. And so we talked about that afterwards, and I thought it was actually a very rich feedback conversation. So seeking guidance, if there is resonance and there is an opportunity for empathetic reaction, is that still against the rules?
Rules are there to be broken, okay?
Sure.
But having said that, I think that what was, interestingly, you kind of responded to that question despite you keeping to those rules and not saying, it's amazing you should say that because me too. You felt perhaps even a greater connection because you felt heard. So I would suggest to you the invitation is to be aware of that temptation and put it aside. And for example, as a coach, I so often feel this because I coach a lot internally at the BBC, and I'm coaching people, and I've bloody well been there. We were just talking earlier about, the challenges of working in big bureaucracies. And it's so tempting to want to say that and even to impart some of my experiences, but I know they're mine, and it's taking attention to me, and it's disempowering the other person. How much better it is if they, when people are often, especially if they're struggling with something, and they're sharing it with you, and you want to say, I've been there. I think you can express that with your heart and not with words, and that is more powerful. And also, you're changing that focus, that spotlight, and they'll say, well, how did you cope with it? And you'll tell your solution, but it's not theirs, number one. Number two, because they haven't thought of it themselves, they're much less likely to implement it. And what you'll often find is that when people are talking about a frustration and you want to, let's say my kid is, frustrated about her job or something, and I'll want to say, yes, but there are all this other context and things, and she'll just argue with me and think I'm not taking the other side, and why don't I listen to her? But when I do this deep listening with her, often she'll just say, well, actually, it wasn't that bad. And she'll put herself the other side because it doesn't come from me, because I've given her that space to do that. So I would, you'll have another chance to practice at lunch. So that's the good news. So see what that feels like. I would say be aware. And certainly when I coached at the beginning, I found that so, so hard. Because it comes from a place of empathy. As you say, you want to connect, you want to show your heart, but I think you can express it. And when you do the feedback with each other, over lunch, because I think feedback's really important, you can reflect on whether you felt that and what that felt like for the other person, and whether they sensed that you had been there. And I know actually from coaching that I get feedback after processes, and there are times when there's been such close resonance and I haven't said it, and I've managed to keep myself in, which I don't always. They have felt that. It was somebody wrote something like, I felt that Emily really deeply understood what I was going through, and I did not tell her that. And I think it's more powerful for all those reasons. But, it's an invitation, and you can see what it like. Any more thoughts of people who want to share? Including frustrations and things that didn't go well, or they went way off topic and found it was impossible? Okay. So I would say that it is super hard to do, as I said, when we're feeling angry, when we feel that this is really important, does anybody ever get on their sort of self-indignant high horse, and we feel that to even listen to somebody who feels different is a betrayal of our own values? Yeah, certainly I felt that. I don't know if anybody else. There was a neighbor of mine, actually, who, I'm Jewish, and she was arguing on our WhatsApp chat, it was before COVID, about there was some other area they were going to put in there's a particular weird sort of string that certain people put around Jewish neighborhoods, Jewish people, in order that people who are very orthodox can carry and wheel. It's about a walled city. It's a kind of thing. And she had written in this WhatsApp something about the fact, I'm really worried about this happening in our neighborhood because people are all going to move in and then it will completely change the neighborhood, sort of stuff, yeah? So I felt kind of uncomfortable, and I was like, quite high horseish, and I thought I shouldn't really talk to her because it's, And then from doing this work, I just thought I absolutely should talk to her because it's so important to hear her and for me to hear her and us to have a conversation. She's actually the most lovely person, and she said it out of total ignorance, not really understanding. And, it was quite hard for me because I used to feel so self-righteous about people with different values. And it was so interesting. And she is organising not only a Jubilee party this weekend, also a monarchy and a Republican Jubilee party for those who believe in everything. So maybe she's also made a bit of a journey in that space. But once she understood from my perspective what it felt like reading that text, in that WhatsApp, it was just brilliant. We had a really, really good conversation, and we both learned quite a lot, which was interesting. So I know you want to practice this more. Good news over lunch, but for a bit more fun, we're going to give you some envelopes, yeah? Do not open these envelopes, but do be aware of the colour, because you've got to find somebody you've not yet spoken to with a different coloured envelope and sit down, and then you open your envelope when you've seated down and had your food, maybe at the same time as you're eating, and see how that goes. You can eat, they can talk. And then you ask them the question in your envelope. And then we'll have a bear sound after kind of 15 minutes, and it's time to switch over. And the other person listens and talks. and then feedback about how it felt. So you're doing 2 different questions here. And they're kind of fun questions, and obviously only reveal stuff you feel is safe and that you feel psychologically safe to talk about and that you feel happy to talk about. See what happens, and happy to have a chat with you. If there is interest, Sophie can share with you a cheat sheet afterwards, sort of 2 pages of some of the stuff that we've been doing, or the longer article that I wrote for the Stanford Social Innovation Review. But it's been really fun. I'm really grateful. You perhaps weren't quite expecting this when you turned up at this summit. So I'm grateful for you guys all playing and having fun and playing along with this. Thank you very, very much.